Hello there, and welcome back to Hydroponics Daily, your go-to podcast for everything soilless cultivation. I'm your host, Dr. Russell Sharp, and as I said at the end of yesterday's episode, my doctor, my GP, has asked me whether white rice is a source of arsenic, whether that's true or not. And so I thought I'd go into arsenic and where you can get it from crops and what you can do about it. So there are two forms of arsenic. Well, let's talk about arsenic to begin with. Arsenic is a heavy metal. It's on the periodic table, so it's an element, so you can't create it or destroy it. That's important because when you pollute soil, it's going to stay around for a long time. It's not going to decompose or rot away. I said in a previous episode that people often get confused between arsenic and cyanide because they're those poisons that you find in Hercule Poirot or Agatha Christie novels, whereas they're completely different. Cyanide is an organic compound that can be broken down, whereas arsenic is always around. And so when it comes to contamination of soils, then arsenic is much more of a bigger deal. And there's two crops where it's a big issue. The first is in rice, and it occurs in two forms in rice. In all crops really. Inorganic arsenic, which is just the compound itself, or organic arsenic, where it's combined with like sugars into a form that can be moved around the plants. Now, there's naturally occurring arsenic in soil and groundwater, and most of the time it's going to be in an unavailable form. So even though it's in the soil, your plants can't actually absorb it. So you might analyze the soil and find there's high levels of arsenic, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be in the crop. So how does it get into rice? Well, when grown in paddy fields, the flooded conditions can mobilize the arsenic, making it more bioavailable. When the oxygen levels decrease and it becomes anaerobic or anoxic, that's another word for it, lack of oxygen, then the arsenic level can turn into a form that's absorbed. It can be reduced into a reduced form, and then that's taken up by the plants. So chemically reduced. If you don't know what that is, then it's basic chemistry. Have a look up. And so that's why you get more arsenic in rice than you would any other crops, because that's a crop where the roots are routinely exposed to flooded conditions. So maybe like water chestnuts would be another crop, perhaps, or maybe cranberries. I don't know what arsenic levels are in cranberries. If you know, let me know. And then there are some countries with higher levels of arsenic around, like Bangladesh, India, parts of the US even, and all three of those will be areas where they grow rice. In the US is a big producer of rice. And then in some areas, especially in the south of the US, in cotton fields, arsenic-based chemicals have been used traditionally to control pest and disease, and there'll be elevated levels. Just like in some country gardens, large manor houses here in the UK, there's high levels of mercury from mercury pesticides used in the past. So mercury there's a risk of it in rice. If you've got really high levels, you get nausea and vomiting and diarrhea and abdominal pains or skin lesions, things like this. But the real thing with arsenic is it's a carcinogen, and so you could get lung, bladder, skin cancers, cardiovascular diseases, neurodevelopment effects, and pregnancy risks. Thing about this is, if you're anything like arsenic or any sort of carcinogen in your gut, if you were to get a cancer anywhere in your digestive system, so bowel cancers, stomach cancer, things like this, then the toxins you eat will be a big issue, but so is the sort of transit time of your food. So a lot of people now are talking about high protein diets, low carbohydrate diets and things like this, but they're forgetting the very important role that fiber has in your diet. And if you look at the countries where people have a very high intake of dietary fiber, then the levels of cancer from bowel cancer is very low in those countries. So, people talk about, fruits and vegetables from like a protein or a vitamin perspective and healthy eating from that perspective, but don't forget fiber. A lot, especially people who do a lot of fitness and bodybuilding and gym work and things like this, they often forget fiber. And this is my theory about why a lot of a lot of gym goers getting serious illnesses. It's because things like arsenic could have a long time in your digestive system, especially if you're eating healthy rice and things like this, you're not sure. Now, often thought that white rice is less healthy than brown rice, but actually, when it comes to arsenic, brown rice has more arsenic because the arsenic accumulates in the bran. And then rice from Southeast Asia, Bangladesh, India, and parts of the US tend to have higher levels than rice from California, Pakistan, and India, apparently basmati. So that's something to consider. Now, the way to get around this is to rinse thoroughly and cook in excess water. So 6:1 water to rice ratios will help alleviate the arsenic, drain the arsenic away. And then also think about using other grains like quinoa, millet, oats, barley, buckwheat, things like this. I'm a big fan of millet. I think millet is a really good one. And then obviously choose basmati or jasmine rice. They tend to have lower arsenic levels. And then the other food that is very high in arsenic is seaweed. And I go to a lot of conferences on seaweed and people say, oh, in the UK, we eat the lowest amount of seaweed in the developed world. And this is why we have, such issues with health here in the UK. And look at Japan, they live for a long time and look how long people in Japan live for and their life expectancy. And that's true, they do have a long life expectancy if they don't die of bowel cancer in the meantime. And Japan has a very high level of bowel cancer, and it's thought that it's due to the arsenic in the seaweed. And so if you combine two of their staple foods there of rice and seaweed, there's two staple foods there that are high in arsenic. So the Japanese diet might not be all it's cracked up to be. And then obviously when the Fukushima plant went into meltdown, there was also radioactive compounds in the seaweed. And I was studying LED growth lights over in Japan when they were first kicking off back in the early noughties. And I went over there to study Chinese yams, and they were growing Chinese yams instead of as a substitute for seaweed because of all the toxins that were thought to be in the seaweed due to Fukushima and also natural levels. So certain seaweeds are higher in arsenic than others. Sargassum has a very high arsenic level compared to other species. Sargassum is the one that is a nuisance. It's almost like a weed in the Caribbean Ocean, Caribbean Sea, and Mexico and places like this, the Gulf of Mexico, and rots on the beaches and things like this. And they're always looking for a use for it, and often cheap biostimulants contain sargassum, whereas actually you want to use Ascophyllum nodosum that's the best biostimulant seaweed extract. And so, seaweed is another source of arsenic. I'm going to do another episode on cadmium because there's lots of news on cadmium, but I'm not going to do it straight after this one because two episodes about pollutants is not great. Obviously, if you're growing hydroponically, what are the key takeaways here? The first key takeaway is if you do not aerate your growing media and you're growing hydroponically and your roots are suffering from lack of oxygen, then they could be absorbing heavy metals and toxins like arsenic from your grow media. So especially if you're using a soil-based system or anything that potentially has arsenic in it, then you need to be careful that you don't produce these conditions that would reduce the arsenic and make it available to the plants. So always make sure you have good aeration, which I'm sure you do because your plants would suffer if you didn't. So as I say, we'll do another episode on cadmium because there's a lot of issues around landfill, water that comes off landfill tips in the UK, and this horrible gunk is being used on farmland, which is a bit of a shocker, really. It doesn't happen in France, but happens in the UK and it needs to be exposed. And so I'm going to be talking about that in a future episode. But this one is specifically about arsenic, and arsenic will be in residues from pollutants and things like this. So in this toxic gunk that's coming off the landfills that they're spraying onto the fields, that will be a source of arsenic as well. So unfortunately, if you want to make sure your food doesn't contain a lot of toxins, you can't just rely on the government nowadays to make sure that that's the case. You're best to grow your own, you know what you're putting on it, as always, and that is the beauty of hydroponics and home cultivation anyway. All right, that's been Hydroponics Daily for today. If you've got any comments about arsenic, you know anything else about arsenic, then let me know. And as always, thank you very much for listening. If you found any usefulness in this, if it wasn't the worst podcast you've ever listened to, then please leave an Apple podcast review. And That would shoot us at the charts. Thank you very much for listening. Until next time, goodbye.